obviously this operation is a military dilemma for Vladimir Putin. He's got to work out what to do and how to win this territory back. And of course, that's going to be his top priority. He wants to, as in the words of one British military official I spoke to, he wants to squash this pimple. And no doubt he will try to do that. But, the defenders were just these kids, and some Russians have been appearing on television saying shame on Putin for sending these kids here, and so it's also become a political dilemma for Putin. I think this whole situation close to the border.
Don't shoot with conscripts is the headline on the front of the Sunday Times. Matthew Campbell, the foreign features editor, has spoken to Russian soldiers captured by Ukraine after their incursion into the Kursk region of Russia. The young men, warned by Putin they would be tortured or even killed by the Ukrainians, instead received medical attention and even pastries and cigarettes bought for them by Ukrainian soldiers with their own money. We're going to speak to Matthew shortly about his conversations with those captured Russian soldiers and what it tells us about their morale and the course of the war.
The Democratic National Convention begins in Chicago tomorrow, an opportunity for presidential candidate Kamala Harris to speak about policy and outline her vision for presidency. But what do delegates and the wider US public want and need from her? We'll hear from Katie Harbath, former elections director at Facebook, about how Harris's digital campaign is shaping this presidential race.
And we're going to continue our focus on the government's planning policies and the aim of building 1.5 million new homes in this parliament. We're going to get the thoughts of a London property developer and also a campaigner who is against government plans to build, even if they go against local objections. Some may call her a NIMBY. Rosie Pearson, the co-founder of the Community Planning Alliance, says that's an unjustified caricature.
That'll be an interesting conversation a bit later on. You can get in touch with us on all the stories we're talking about this morning. If you've got a favourite seat on the aeroplane, then you're welcome to share that with us, because we are loving these messages. Lots of them are very champagne focused, I have to be honest. But you can keep those coming.
We know our audience.
Yeah, we certainly do. And you can and by the way, very relatable. We're all here for the champagne. And you can get involved in any of the other stories as well. Perhaps it's on universities we'll be discussing in a moment. Perhaps it's on planning policy as well. You can text us 87222 and start your message with the word Times. You can WhatsApp us. The number is 0333 003 2353, or the email address is studio@times.radio.
This is Times Radio Breakfast. It's 6 minutes past 8. So Ukraine is hoping its offensive into Russia could change the narrative of the 2.5-long-year war. Its advancement into the Kursk region is the first significant attack on Russian soil since 1941 and aims to force Moscow to redeploy troops and ease pressure on the Eastern Front, where Russia is making progress. Yuri Sak is advisor to the Minister of Strategic Industries in Ukraine.
This was a very meticulously planned operation, and of course there was a lot of intelligence data gathering that happened before the implementation of the operation. It shouldn't actually be surprising that that Russia has left some parts of their border unprotected. But of course, for us, the main factor of success was the element of surprise in terms of our planning. And, we have shown again to the world that we're capable. This is what our president said. We're capable of surprise operations. We are fully conscious of the fact that this war is very similar to the fight between David and Goliath. Russia is a larger country. It has much more resource base. It has more manpower. But at the same time, when we act asymmetrically, when we fight a smart war, we are achieving the success that surprises everybody.
Well, that success has certainly altered the West's perception of the conflict. James Nixie is head of the Russia and Eurasia programme at Chatham House and tells Times Radio the conflict outcome still hangs in the balance.
This is actually a finely balanced war at the moment. So I think really the next 12 months, I mean, people say this every 12 months, that the next 12 months are going to be crucial. So we could always say that. But the truth is that both sides are still in this to win it. And that means, as far as we're concerned in the West, that we must help Ukraine to do so.
Well, tens of thousands of Russians have fled their homes in the border region, saying the government had downplayed the threat of invasion. It took many by surprise, including this woman.
I was in my room. I lay huddled up and it went bang, bang, bang.
Well, while many civilians escaped, soldiers did not. Ukraine claims to have captured several hundred Russian soldiers, which they hope will strengthen their hand in prisoner exchange negotiations. The Sunday Times foreign features editor Matthew Campbell has visited a prison in northeast Ukraine and spoken to those Russian prisoners. He's with us now. Morning, Matthew.
Morning, Chloe.
This really is a fantastic bit of journalism and a great read this morning on the front of the Sunday Times. I mean, first of all, just tell us the circumstances in which you spoke to these prisoners. Were there restrictions on what you said? And were the prisoners forced to speak to you? Were they happy to speak to you? How did it all work?
Well, it was really quite a relaxed encounter. I was shown into this prison in northeastern Ukraine, whose exact location I was asked not to divulge, presumably for security reasons. But it was in the prisoners are in a basement, and the Ukrainians described it as the safest place in the prison, given that the place where the jail is now regularly attacked with Russian missiles. So the Ukrainian guards were in the cells when I spoke to the prisoners, but didn't, occasionally they were listening and sometimes they joined in the conversation. It was all quite friendly in a sense. One of a very sort of avuncular prison official showing me into the first cell said, listen, these lads were terrified when they first arrived here. I said, calm down and it's okay. Nobody's going to be shot. They were told by their commanding officers that, they would be tortured and even worse, that they could be executed. And one of the young prisoners I spoke to said that, he had obeyed his commander's injunction not to be taken alive and actually detonated a grenade, expecting it to kill him, so that he wouldn't have to face these horrors at the hands of the Ukrainian captors.
But he was saved, wasn't he, by Ukrainian medics, and indeed was grateful for that.
That's right, yes. And, obviously Ukraine is at pains to show how well it treats Russian prisoners of war. But in this case, the Russian prisoners that I spoke to seemed to be generally quite cheerful. And although they looked a bit pale and malnourished, actually, I would say. And, well, the first thing that struck me was how young they are. These are conscripts, unlike some of the other prisoners that Ukraine has captured in the course of the war. Russia sends its grown-up soldiers to the front in the east, Donbass, where the main battle is going on. These were guys doing their military service. Everyone over 18 men in Russia have to do a year's compulsory military service. So they're barely out of school. They were 21 and 22 and didn't expect to be in a battle.
And so what was the sense you got from them? Because being conscripts, clearly, they had another life. They didn't expect this to happen. What did they tell you about their experiences? What sense did you get about morale amongst them?
Well, what emerged, I think, from these encounters, I spoke to at least half a dozen of them in some detail, was the chaos and confusion that they witnessed when basically they were taken completely by surprise. As I said, they never expected to be in the war in the first place. One of them, a young chap called Fyodor from St. Petersburg, said that, he heard this gunfire and tank fire, and the commander said, well, it turns out we're surrounded, and, but don't retreat. And then, others said that they asked their commanding officers what was going on, and one of the senior officers got on the radio to his battalion commander, but he had already run away. So it was complete chaos. They basically, as I said, had been told that the Ukrainians would kill them if they surrendered. So some of them trusted that they wouldn't be and said, "We're conscripts. Please, don't shoot us." As they surrendered, somebody said. One person recounted how one of his friends had shouted out, "Don't shoot, we're conscripts," and the Ukrainians basically said, "Put your guns down and take your vests off and come on out." These were people who were in a house, and they did. And yes, they were very grateful, actually, not to be. Considering what they expected, they told us that. these Ukrainian captors on the way to the prison had stopped at a shop even to buy them some cigarettes and some food. They were starving. They hadn't eaten for days. These ones had been hiding for 2 or 3 days in a forest. Then eventually decided to surrender because they didn't have any supplies left.
The line's slightly scratchy, but Matthew, I'm going to try and carry on because there's just so much to pick through in this article that you've written on the front of the Sunday Times today. Not least a surreal moment when there was a conversation between some of these Russian prisoners and a Ukrainian prison guard about the virtues of Top Gear and Jeremy Clarkson, which just kind of, brings us back to the fact that, we're all people and we all watch TV, and there's a lot that is the same between all of us.
Yes, exactly. It was really quite surreal. There was one cell with, I guess, 15 prisoners in it, and they were all in bunk beds. And in the corner of the room, there was a TV, and I think it was Garfield. There was this film playing. I think it was Billy Connolly staring out of the screen. But then, we were chatting, and again, it was this young chap called Fyodor. He's an architecture student from St. Petersburg, and he was talking to me with 2 of his mates, and I explained very carefully that I was reporting for a British newspaper, the Sunday Times, and and then suddenly said, "You know what? You look like Jeremy Clarkson," and I don't think I do particularly, but I didn't know whether to feel flattered or not. But and they said, "Yeah, he's my favourite. I love Top Gear," and then there was this Ukrainian prison guard standing next to us, sort of kind of a young guy, who was vaguely listening. And he said, "Oh, it's the same in Ukraine, Top Gear is the most popular thing on TV for young Ukrainians." And then they started having their own conversation, basically about their favorite episodes, which went on for some time. It's quite surreal. And it does show that, that these are, they're on opposing sides in the war. But obviously they have so much in common, and even language close to the border. Russians and Ukrainians speak each other's languages, and that's obviously been you find that in lots of parts of Ukraine. Everyone speaks Russian, and beyond that, though, there are these cultural bonds, I suppose you'd call it.
I wonder as well if you got a sense, and maybe this is difficult for you to answer, that the reason why these Russian soldiers were being so well looked after is because Ukraine wants to use them as part of a prisoner swap. Do you think that's fair?
Yes, I think that Ukraine was eager to perhaps show these prisoners because, as I said, they're conscripts. They're just kids, really. This also, they exemplify, in a sense, the Russian weakness on the border. You might say, well, obviously there are going to be parts of the border that aren't defended, but this is really quite close to, this is the border with Ukraine in an area where there's been fighting going on. And, they send these young conscripts to defend it. And already inside Russia, I believe there is some anger at the sense of, Russia sending these youngsters to defend the homeland, as it were, against invaders who have now seized an enclave inside Russia. The first time since the Second World War that this has happened. And so this creates obviously this operation is a military dilemma for Vladimir Putin. He's got to work out what to do and how to win this territory back. And of course, that's going to be his top priority. He wants to, as in the words of one British military official I spoke to, he wants to squash this pimple. And no doubt he will try to do that. But, the defenders were just these kids, and some Russians have been appearing on television saying shame on Putin for sending these kids here, and so it's also become a political dilemma for Putin. I think this whole situation close to the border.
Matthew, so good to speak to you this morning. Thank you ever so much.
Pleasure.
That is the Sunday Times foreign features editor, Matthew Campbell. It really is an incredible piece of journalism on the front page of the Sunday Times. Don't shoot, we're conscript, begged the captured Russians. And I really can't just re-emphasize enough the photograph on the front page of the paper of, I mean, they just look like young boys. I mean, I know some of them are in their early 20s. Many of them just don't look it. They're sitting in what is obviously their prison cell, a shared prison cell. You can see the bars on the window. They're sitting on sort of very basic metal bunk beds. Yeah, they just very, very young and fresh-faced. And yeah, really fascinating insight into that Matthew Campbell has been to speak to these Russian soldiers in Ukraine. If you've got a digital subscription to The Times and The Sunday Times, you can go online now and read that at thetimes.com.